When I was fortunate enough to play D4 early a few months ago, I didn't expect that by the end of the closed beta, I would be maining Rogue. Now this is because I stumbled into some aspects while playing the closed beta, as well as ability combinations that play really well together. The way that this setup works is to use imbuements on Twisting Blades and Shadow Step that will cause many AoE explosions and very high burst damage to big mobs and single targets alike. Not only is it incredibly strong, but it's actually really fun as well. You'll be dashing across the world map from mob to mob or through dungeons. It may take a little getting used to at first, but I think that most people will enjoy this build. So taking a look at the skill tree, you want to take Puncture first. It's a decent builder with the modifiers, and I also like that it can be used at range and up close. Also, I have the modifier that will throw 3 blades instead of 1, and each will deal 35% of its base damage, and hitting an enemy with at least 2 blades will make them vulnerable. Next up though is Twisting Blades, and this of course is the core ability and the center of this build. Twisting Blades you will stick into an enemy, and when they return to you 1.5 seconds later, they'll damage everyone on the way. The modifiers that I've taken is to reduce your active cooldowns by 1 second per enemy that they pass through, and also to increase the Twisting Blades damage by 30% when returning. Next is our agility skill, which is Shadow Step, and I have a very good aspect for this too, which makes it even better. I've only taken 1 modifier just because we're so limited for skill points in the beta, but this is that damaging enemies with Shadow Step will increase your crit chance on them for 3 seconds. Next up is our ability, which gives us a lot more sustain, and that is Dark Shroud. The modifiers that I've taken on this are that the shadows have a 10% chance to not be consumed, and also while you have 2 of these active, you gain 10% critical strike chance. And now we're looking at the Shadow Imbuement, which is really what takes this build to a whole new level. The modifiers that you want to take on this will give you a 25% increased critical strike chance, and the primary explosion of Shadow Imbuement will make an enemy vulnerable for 2 seconds. And super important, next to Shadow Imbuement, you need to take these passives, Shadow Crash, and especially Consuming Shadow, because each time those AoE explosions kill something, it is going to generate 10 energy. Finally, you're going to want to take Shadow Clone. I think it's the best ultimate with this setup, and it's also what adds a lot of the burst damage to bosses as well. Now, the amount of points that you may want to put into each ability or passives are going to heavily depend on the gear you have that may modify that for you, or how many skill points you have available to you at the time. I personally went with Sturdy, which will gain 8% close damage reduction, as well as Siphoning Strikes, which will heal for 2% of your maximum life when you critically strike close enemies. I've also opted in for Exploit, which means you'll deal 6% increased damage to healthy enemies, and Malice, which means you will deal 3% increased damage to vulnerable enemies, which is very useful in this build because the shadow abilities are going to make enemies vulnerable. Now, there's a lot of other useful passives in here that you can take, and you'll also have the option to take a lot more of them if you can find the appropriate gear that will give you skill points so that you can put points in other places. The specialization that you're going to want for this build is Inner Sight. This is going to allow you to have unlimited usage of abilities for 4 seconds every time you proc it, and because you're always doing so much damage and swapping targets with this build, it will constantly be up. And what's good about it is because it's unlimited, you can just keep using Twisting Blades for the 4-second duration, and when you dash away, you've probably still got 4 sets of them inside one of the enemies, so it's instantly going to reset all of your cooldowns and may even instantly reset your Inner Sight gauge as well. Now let's take a look at some of the aspects that you'll need to keep an eye out for. So the first one that I've got here is extremely strong. So we have Dark Shroud for the crit chance and also to take less damage, but what this aspect's going to do is create an explosion every time that a Dark Shroud is removed. Since this setup is built around having your cooldowns all the time, you'll be using Dark Shroud a lot, so you will pretty much constantly be taking damage, but a lot of that damage will be mitigated and will be causing explosive damage to everyone around you. The next aspect is for Shadow Step, which is pretty much a must for this build, to be honest. This is going to give you an extra charge for Shadow Step, but also when you kill an enemy with Shadow Step, it will refund a charge and increase the damage of Shadow Step by 4% for 2 seconds up to 20%. Next up, we have the Twisting Blades aspect. What this does is that when the blades return to you, they will orbit around you, dealing 12% of Twisting Blades damage per hit, and this will also be based on the distance that the blades had to return. And finally, something very nice again on a class that's supposed to be doing damage all the time and using cooldowns all the time is that critical strikes with core skills will increase your attack damage by 34% for 3 seconds. So just for a bit of theory crafting and other things you guys can look out for, I dug into the database of all the aspects that we know about. Now, one of them I did actually have in an earlier version of the build, and this is called Aspect of Arrow Storms. This has Lucky Hit, which means that your range skills have a 10% chance to create an arrow storm at the target's present location. With the amount of times you're dashing around and damaging enemies, this will probably proc quite a lot if you can get it with this build, and will just be extra free damage. On top of that, there is Aspect of Corruption, which just makes your imbuements 20% more potent, which is kind of insane because the shadow imbuement is so strong already. There is also Aspect of Unstable Imbuements, which means casting a skill that is imbued will create an explosion around you, dealing X amount of damage of the same type. Again, you're always casting skills, so this one will be very strong for this build. And finally, I found information of a Twisting Blade aspect, which will cause an explosion when they return to you, dealing X damage and X additional damage based on the distance the blades have traveled. Now, I don't know if that one is the same as the one I showed you earlier in the video, but an older version. But if it is a separate version, that is also going to be extremely strong. So I've seen a few similar setups to this, but this is how I like to play it. So what I like to do is imbue and shroud just before I go into a fight. And what you're going to want to do is stick your Twisting Blades into one end of a mob and then dash to the other side of the mob so that everyone on the way takes damage, which is going to reduce your cooldowns as well. But the thing is, you can actually stick 2 sets of blades into an enemy before they return to you. So if you do it fast enough, you can actually stick 2 sets of blades into your first enemy and dash across to the end of the mob. This will nearly always reduce all of your cooldowns to 1 second or 0 seconds based on any other modifiers you may have for ability cooldown on kills or AoE damage or vulnerable damage, which is then going to allow you to repeat the process. So a lot of using this build is going to be sticking the blades in one end of a mob, dashing to the other end, and then reducing all of those cooldowns to repeat it again. You can clear through literally hundreds of mobs at a time in a dungeon. You can just keep fighting through the whole dungeon. You can have them all kited to the end, and then it's very easy to just clear them all out. So yeah, for me, this build is great. I really like the high mobility aspect of it. It feels skillful. It also is very impactful. And honestly, it's just straight up fun to play. Now, I don't think this is going to be the absolute optimal version of this as we're so early in the game. There's going to be aspects that we don't know exist, and who knows what the Paragon system will do to it later. But in terms of an early game build, this is extremely strong. If you guys happen to find any aspects or better versions of this, I would love to read them in the comment section down below. I by no means think that this will be the end game build, but I do think that some variation of this is possible, and I can't wait to see what other aspects will do to this build. With so many options at such an early stage in the game, it honestly could be pretty crazy by the end. So that's everything from me. If you guys enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like, as it really does help us out, and don't forget to hit that notification bell next to the subscribe button so that you get notified when our videos go live. Thank you for watching. Take care and peace, people.